Welcome to the Timur Podcast, a podcast where you and I go back to look at the man they call Timur. And while traveling through his life and story, it is our goal to understand what he did, how he did it, and why it all matters. Now, today's episode is going to be a bit different than our normal episodes, so if this is your first episode with us, welcome, but realize that this is kind of a different sort of weird episode. You actually picked a great first episode to listen to because today's episode is going to be a brief summary of everything we've kind of covered thus far. Basically all the background information to understanding the arrival of Timur. Because as you well may know, Timur's story, but especially his early life and rise to greatness, is complicated, controversial, and crazy. So understanding the background information will really help us all out. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes of this podcast, you might want to do that, but in any event, hopefully this short summary episode helps cement in our minds the political scene and history at the birth of Timur. And with that, let's get into this. In the year 1200 CE, the world was not politically united in any real way. There were powerhouses, sure. You had factions like the Sung dynasty in China, the Byzantine Empire, the Ayyubid dynasty of Egypt, the Kingdom of England, and the Kingdom of France, blah blah blah, you get the point. But there was no power that reigned supreme. Further, most of the political powers at this time were settled powers. That is, they had homes and roads and cities, and maintained the land they were on instead of constantly being on the move. But being constantly on the move was a lifestyle that certainly wasn't extinct. There were hundreds of nomadic tribes out there leading their livestock in continual search for more grazing land. And the area in which you find the greatest concentration of these nomadic peoples was the Eurasian steppe, a more or less flat plain that extends from roughly modern-day Hungary and Romania all the way to eastern Russia and Mongolia, and from Siberia in the north to the heartland of the Middle East in the south. And since the dawn of humankind, really, there have been several times in which a leader or a host of leaders manages to unite several of these nomadic peoples together under one banner. This is nearly impossible to do for many reasons, but if it could be done, that leader would find himself in control of a force to be reckoned with. For nomads are natural hunters, and the hunting of elk or deer by bow is really not too different than hunting man. So as history tells us, at certain times a nomadic storm from the steppe would come crashing down onto settled society, bringing with it an unquantifiable amount of suffering and destruction, but also new opportunities such as better trade, fewer criminals, and things like that. Attila the Hun is perhaps one of the most infamous of these nomadic leaders, but names of these tribes like the Magyars, or Vandals, or Visigoths, or Seljuks, and the Cumans, they carry power with them to this very day. Even today, even though we have really nothing to fear from nomadic threats, we still have this lingering fear, or at least respect, at the mention of these names. And no nomadic name demands more respect or attention than that of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was a nomad born to one of the many warring tribes in 13th century Mongolia. His story is an incredible one, but today we're interested in understanding just the basics until those basics lead to Timur. And the fact that I'm skipping Genghis's entire early life is an insult to his exploits and his journey, but here we go. By the year 1206 Common Era, Genghis Khan had managed to unite 6 of the largest Mongolian tribes around him, as well as numerous smaller clans. And now Genghis Khan had great power, and unfortunately for the millions of people living throughout the world at this point, Genghis Khan knew he had great power. Sweeping out of the heartland of Mongolia, Genghis Khan and his united Mongols absorbed the neighboring tribes or crushed them in combat, growing their ranks even more, making this unstoppable wave even higher. Then it was into northern China against the Jin dynasty, sweeping through this foreign land and for the first time showing a settled people what a mounted Mongolian army that was united, what this army could do. Then it was to the west, crushing the Kara-Kitai Confederation in what's much of western China today. And then the Mongols found themselves right next to the Islamic world, and in particular, the mighty Khwarezmian Empire, a young empire that was also expanding and expanding rapidly. Well, after some disputes, or maybe a series of false flag attacks, Genghis Khan led his armies into the Khwarezmian Empire, which today would be considered Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Iran, and others. But the Khwarezmian Empire crumbled beneath the weight of the might of the Mongols. Nothing could stop this Mongolian wave from the steppe. Now, before dying, Genghis Khan put plans forward to help prevent his empire from crumbling with his death. He knew that his people, his family, and in particular his 4 favorite sons would have to remain strong and united in order for his empire to remain so as well. So he split his empire into 4 parts, with a part going to each son, or in the case of his son Ogedai, leaving the Khanship title itself. And as a few historians point out, this preparation and foresight was arguably the greatest accomplishment of Genghis's career. For after his death in the year 1227 CE, his empire did not fracture into a million pieces as so often was the pattern of the day. No, his empire stayed strong, and this was only the beginning of Mongolian domination. Genghis's son and successor Ogedai Khan proved worthy as the next great Khan. Under Ogedai's command and leadership, the Mongol Empire expanded its realm on all sides. Further into Iran the Mongols pushed, then the Caucasus, the Christian kingdoms of Armenia and Georgia were defeated and subjugated, the Jin dynasty in northern China was crushed, and then the Sung dynasty was engaged. Then Korea was invaded, then into Russia and the Ukraine and Lithuania and Poland and Hungary. The Mongols were now the undisputed masters of most of the Eurasian steppe. But again, this is just a summary episode, so we're moving on. With Ogedai's death in the year 1241, his wife, the Queen Torigen, became the ruler of the empire, pushing the borders even further and having kings and sultans and priests and messengers bow before her in her court. And then once he was ready, Torigen's son Guyuk became the 3rd great Khan of the Mongol Empire. And although Guyuk only ruled for about 2 years before his death, he also continued this legacy of expansion. His wife, the Queen Ogul-Hamish, became queen regent with his death, but by this point, the cracks in the empire start to show, and they show deeply. Ogul-Hamish was not as skillful a ruler as her husband, or certainly not her mother-in-law had been, and the old Mongol aristocracy was disgusted by how friendly she was with a Muslim servant, a woman many believed was a witch. And above all, several of the families of the 4 original sons of Genghis Khan were just sick and tired of Ogedai's family having this monopoly on the throne. And so there was a coup, and the coup actually worked. With the successful coup, a man named Monk of the family of the youngest of those 4 original sons, Tolui or Toloi, became the 4th great Khan of the Mongol Empire. And with Monk, like his 3 predecessors, the empire expanded even more. Vietnam, Tibet, southern China, central Anatolia, Iraq, Syria, and more were all brought underneath Mongol control. But Monk's death in the year 1259 marked a turning point for the empire. By this point, the cracks had become so large that they were basically unfixable. Each of the 4 pieces of the empire, which Genghis had so long ago mapped out and given to his sons in order to keep their appetites for further power satisfied, well, each of these 4 pieces were now yearning for more power, and for power that didn't have to answer to any great Khan hundreds of miles away in Mongolia. No, these 4 pieces, or the 4 Khanates as they're usually called, they wanted to be their own empires. One of these Khanates, the Yuan dynasty of China and parts of Mongolia, was the Khanate that claimed to be the true successor of the leadership of the empire. Through the dynasty's first emperor, Kublai Khan, and then with the next emperor, Kublai's grandson, Timur Khan, the Yuan dynasty fought for a unified Mongol empire. And despite several long and bloody civil wars, the empire was reunited twice, but for very short periods of time, and in nothing but name, really. And with the death of Timur Khan, the Yuan dynasty would slowly but steadily lose its power until the Chinese Revolution finally pushed out the Mongolian overlords. To the west, the Golden Horde, the second Khanate if you will, ruled an area extending through Kazakhstan, southern and western Russia, the Ukraine, parts of the Caucasus, and even much of Eastern Europe. The Golden Horde, being on lands most like the steppe back home, kept much of its strength and even expanded its holdings for the first few decades of its life. And for where we are in the story now, or where we'll be with the next episode on Timur's birth and early life, the Golden Horde is actually doing okay. Not for long, but for now it's doing okay. So let's move to the third Khanate down to the south, the Ilkhanate or Ilkhanate, which ruled over what's today Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and parts of the Caucasus. Now, although the Ilkhanate was okay for a little while, they soon found themselves in a dire situation. Seemingly constant war with its brother Mongols of other Khanates, a suppressed population of Muslims who grew increasingly unhappy under Mongol rule, and the rising Egyptian powerhouse of the Mamluk Sultanate meant that collapse was inevitable. Although the Ilkhanate would be lucky enough to have a few powerful last breaths due to skilled and wise leaders, the pressure would eventually prove to be too much and the empire would shatter into many little smaller pieces. The fourth Khanate is what we call the Chagatai Khanate, named after Genghis's second favorite son, Chagatai. Now, the Chagatai Khanate consisted of what today would be parts of western China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, southwestern Mongolia, Tajikistan, and last but certainly not least, Uzbekistan. The Chagatai Khanate managed to survive for about 100 years, but was steadily on the decline for most of this time. Being sandwiched between the often hostile Yuan dynasty and the almost always hostile Ilkhanate meant two front wars were common, rebellions on the inside were commonplace, a host of inept leaders and rival ruling lines that never went away rotted away the Chagatai Khanate from the inside out. Finally, in the mid-1340s, probably around the year 1347, the Chagatai Khanate split in half, with the western half usually called Transoxiana, and the eastern half typically referred to as Mogulistan. So, that is a very skeletal summary of what this podcast has covered from episode 1 to where we are in the narrative now, roughly around the year 1340 or so, give or take 10 years. And you'll see why that's not a very specific date with the next episode on Timur's early life and birth. But anyway, right now, the Mongol Empire is no more, but all four Khanates still exist, although some are certainly doing better than others. The Golden Horde to the north is doing okay, for now. It hasn't split or anything yet, and actually it's doing more than okay. It's doing pretty well, with Ozbeg Khan and then Johnny Beg Khan bringing somewhat of a golden age in. But the Golden Horde is not too important to us right now, so don't concern yourself too much with it. We'll get there, but not quite yet. To the far east, the Yuan dynasty is still around, but barely. The Khans and wannabe Khans keep killing each other, there's widespread corruption, famine, plagues, bandit activity, and an increasing hatred of the minority Mongol rulers by the majority Chinese subjects. So around 1340 or so, yeah, the Yuan dynasty is still in control over there, sure, but it's not going well at all. And again, the Yuan dynasty really doesn't connect to the early story and birth of Timur, so we can forget them for now. We'll get there again, but not yet. The two Khanates that do really matter to us at this moment are the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate. The Ilkhanate is arguably doing worse than any of the other three. By the year 1336, which is roughly where we'll be starting next episode, but by 1336 the Ilkhanate has actually collapsed, and a jumble of smaller kingdoms and realms will try to take its place with none of them succeeding. And then on top of this, remember the Black Death is devastating most of the world around this time too, so in a land already trying to rebuild itself from the initial Mongol invasion 100 years prior and all the civil wars since, now people are being wiped out by the plague. It's almost as if this whole area has become a giant power vacuum that's just waiting for some powerful and brilliant warlord to invade and take over. I wonder who that could be. But the Khanate that matters to us the most, and the one we'll spend the most time on, is the Chagatai Khanate. Like I just said, at this point in time, it has split in half, Transoxiana in the west, Mogulistan in the east. Mogulistan has remained more or less Mongolian and Turkish, its people are primarily nomadic and tribal, and most of the people there follow pagan or Buddhist or Nestorian Christianity faiths. Transoxiana, on the other hand, also has large populations of Turkish and Mongolian peoples, and many nomadic tribes too, but also has quite a few heavily populated cities full of settled peoples, like the cities of Samarkand or Bukhara. In addition, most of the people are Muslim here. So while both Transoxiana and Mogulistan had once been part of the same Khanate, there were definitely some differences between them. But Transoxiana, that is the western half, is where our story next episode is going to continue. For it is in this land that a boy named Timur will be born, and thus this is where our journey will really begin. So, if this is your first episode listening to this podcast, well, now you're pretty much caught up to where we are. But regardless of how you found this or who you are, thank you for listening to this fun little summary review episode. If you have any questions or concerns or comments or poems you've written, feel free to contact me via email at timurpodcast.com. Head on over to Twitter at podcasttimur or on Facebook at timurpod. Next episode, which will release either later today or tomorrow, but certainly by the end of the week, will cover the birth and early life of Timur. It's gonna get even more interesting than it has been already. It's gonna get a bit crazy and a bit confusing. Okay, a lot of bit confusing, but we'll get through it and it'll be great. So make sure you're there for me with that. What? Make sure you're there for me with that? Well, it'd be great if you're there for me, but make sure you're there for that with me next episode right here on the Timur Podcast.